Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for having me. It's funny when I start doing these talks, because people often look at me and wonder who the cocky 12-year-old who's wandered to the front is. When I started going on telly, people asked, why isn't he doing his paper round? But I've actually taken the morning off my paper round to speak to you all today, this morning. We've got one big mission, one big task today, and that's to march over to Parliament and leave those MPs gibbering wrecks, rocking in the fetal position and begging for mercy until they promise to finally deal with the housing crisis that scars this country. Now, you look like quite a menacing bunch, so that should be quite straightforward. I'm here partly, though, because I'm like you. I've been a private tenant now for about 12 years. I'm not going to kid you. These days, I get paid enough to afford the extortionate rents that are charged in this city. I know some of you probably think, champagne socialist. I'm actually a Prosecco socialist, let's get that accurate. But, you know, like everybody I think in this room, I've struggled in the past. You know, I've been evicted on a whim, short notice, got saddled with shed loads of debt, just trying to afford the rent, been screwed over by estate agents and their dodgy fees, and landlords finding any old excuse to dock deposits. I reckon these are experiences that most people here can probably identify with. And that's why we're all here. Enough is enough. Our political elite, well, they've got away with allowing this country's housing crisis to fester year after year after year and doing absolutely nothing about it. The thing is, we don't get change by waiting for the powerful patiently to wake up one day full of generosity in order to act. We've got to put pressure on Westminster, not to ask politely, but to demand change. And that is how progress has always happened in this country. Let's just consider where we're at now. There are now 5 million people trapped on social housing waiting lists. These are people deprived of a basic need, a basic aspiration, a basic right, an affordable home for them and their children. We're here in London, one of the great booming metropolitan cities, one of the most prosperous cities that has ever existed in the history of this planet. And at the moment, you get Russian oligarchs buying up new build properties in inner London. 80% of all new build properties built by foreign buyers, often left completely vacant, there to make a quick buck. And at the same time, in this booming metropolitan capital city of ours, 1 in 4 young people are stuck in an overcrowded home, with all the consequences that has for their health, for their education, for their well-being, robbing them of dignity and security and a future. Housing in this country is treated not as a need, not as a right, but as an asset to make money out of. Now, we're told constantly that home ownership is that ultimate aspiration that we should desperately crave and aspire to. But it's been in decline, of course, year after year. It's out of reach in any case for millions of people, not least of all young people, unless they can afford to live off the bank of mum and dad and get a handy deposit given to them by their affluent parents. No wonder in the last few years, the number of families in the private rented sector has doubled. A sector with no regulation or barely any real regulation to speak of, with rip-off rents, with no security of tenure, where children can't set down roots in their communities. They end up being shunted from school to school because they can't have a home they can live in for more than a year or 2 or 3. Now we have 1 in 5 of us renting privately. And it's getting bigger all the time. And all too often, we're at the mercy of private landlords. It's a lottery. You could end up with a good landlord, and you could end up with a bad landlord. But you are at their mercy, because the law is on their side and it's not on our side. We get short-term contracts giving us all too little security and poor conditions, and it's getting worse, it's not getting better. According to the Citizens Advice Bureau, at the moment, they're dealing with surging numbers of private tenants with problems like evictions and harassment by landlords, problems with repairs and maintenance. Again, issues I think many of us in this room have all had to deal with. And as for those rents, well, it's a national scandal. Take London, here in London. The average price per month of a 2-bedroom rented property is £1,480. Completely out of the reach of so many people. People driven, in some cases, out of their own communities. In inner London, over 70% on average of people's wages goes on their rent. Where does it leave us? Well, it doesn't just leave us with people desperately trying to scrabble about for money to pay those extortionate rents. It leaves us with a huge housing benefit bill. £24 billion or so every single year of taxpayers' money goes on housing benefit. And here's the thing, it's not lining the pockets of tenants. It's all too often lining the pockets of private landlords charging extortionate rents because they know the state will step in and subsidise those rip-off rents. 1 in 4 Londoners now, 1 in 4, have to claim housing benefit in order to pay their rent. And according to all the official figures, now new claimants, people claiming housing benefit for the first time in the last few years, are overwhelmingly people in work. This is a country, of course, where most people in poverty are in work. They earn their poverty day after day. Their wages too low, their rent's too high, unable to get by and having to scrabble around and at the same time depend on housing benefit, this subsidy for these private landlords charging these rip-off rents in cities like London. As for this government, what are they doing about it? Zilch. They're not building homes. In fact, now if we wanted to meet our housing need, we'd have to be building about 250,000 homes a year. We're on about 120,000 at the moment. And that's one of the lowest since the 1920s, one of the lowest on record in the last few generations in this country. What's their flagship policy on housing instead? Well, it's one of the most cruel and unjust policies a government has inflicted on its own people since World War II in this country, the bedroom tax, forcing people in social housing who are deemed to have a spare room, predominantly disabled people, either to cough up money they don't have or to downsize to smaller properties that don't even exist, or to flee into the private rented sector, which is, as we know, far more expensive, and instead rely on even more housing benefit because of those rip-off rents. But here's the problem, and this is the problem we all face, all of us who want to build a better society. Because what this government does, and their allies all too often in the media, is to redirect our anger, our entirely justifiable anger at the problems that we face, away from those at the top of society, those responsible for the mess we're in, to our neighbours down the streets instead. What it is the politics of envy. Now, it's an odd expression for someone like me to use. It's often people like me accused of the politics of envy. I point out that those at the top of society have never had it so good. The wealth of the top 1,000 people has doubled in the last 5 years during one of the great economic traumas in the history of this nation. Whilst at the same time, nearly 1 million people have been driven to food banks, unable to feed themselves. 300,000 of them children in the 6th richest economy on the face of the earth. So he suggests they should pay up perhaps a bit more money which they can afford. That's the politics of envy. You stand up for the bottom 70%, they call you a class warrior. You stand up for the top 1% and apparently you're a moderate. But it's them who push the politics of envy at all the problems that we face on an everyday basis. They say to low-paid workers, their wages being cut by their boss, their in-work benefits being cut by this government. Don't be angry with your boss. Don't be angry with the government. Envy instead the unemployed person down the road, living in a mansion made out of widescreen television sets. And they say to private sector workers, their pensions decimated, one of the great scandals of our time. Don't be angry with your boss. Envy the nurse or teacher down the road who still has their pension. Why should they when you don't? And they say to people who can't get a secure job because they're being stripped from our economy. Or they say to people who can't get an affordable home because governments won't build them. Don't be angry with the powerful. Envy instead the immigrant down the road getting the job or the home that should rightfully be yours. And what they're telling us is this: you're being mugged. So rather than being angry at the fact you're being mugged, you should be angry at the fact your less deserving neighbour isn't being mugged quite as much as you are. It's the politics of divide and rule. And what they do is they leave us angry with each other, rather than angry at the powerful who are really responsible for the mess that we're in. It wasn't Polish fruit pickers or Nigerian nurses or Lithuanian care workers who plunged this country into economic disaster. It was a financial elite at the top who are still getting away with it today. Tax dodgers who refuse to pay up £25 billion a year whilst the rest of us have to pay that money as our services are slashed away and governments don't build housing. Poverty-paying bosses who leave most people in poverty in work, earning their poverty day after day. These private landlords charging rip-off rents. These are the people who, working people, every day, they're facing their lives getting harder and harder, and those are the people at the top who are responsible for it. Now, we have to have demands. As Frederick Douglass, a 19th century African-American statesman, put it, he said this, Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. There it is. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And that's what we have to learn. That all the gains we have got, all the rights we have got, they weren't given to us by the goodwill and generosity of those above. They were won by the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. People who had demands. And we've got to have these demands. So let's start with them. At a time when working people and others can no longer afford their rents as their wages fall year after year, whilst billions of pounds of public money is spent splashed out subsidising private landlords, no ifs, no buts, control private rents. It's a simple, straightforward demand. Abolish those letting agency fees. Give councils the power again to build a new generation of housing. Council housing. Housing which would create jobs, secure, skilled jobs, which would stimulate the economy, which would bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list and give people a choice, not just to be driven into the hands of private landlords, but to be able to have good, decent, quality, affordable housing provided by the local authorities. These are not radical or extreme demands. They're common sense. They're common sense if we're to build a nation again where people have good jobs and good homes for them and their families. And that's the thing. Those who defend every unjust status quo, they want us to think that injustice is a bit like the weather. You can complain about it, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's wrong. Injustice is created by people, and it can be removed by people as well. And if we look at our history, that history of this country which shows the way you get change isn't because powerful people woke up one day and thought, oh, I'm feeling generous, I'll give women the vote today, but because people fought for their rights. Let's just look at our history. Because I don't think when we come to things like this, when we go up to confront the powerful, sometimes it seems hard. They seem almost invincible. It seems difficult to force them to change. But our ancestors had it harder than we did. They fought far more insurmountable odds, and they won. Go back to the 19th century. The Tolpuddle martyrs, agricultural workers who founded a trade union to fight for their rights and their wages. And they were transported to Australia as punishment. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in one of the first great political demonstrations in the history of this island. And they signed petitions in their hundreds of thousands and they got them back. Other trade unionists who fought for the rights and dignity of working people. The Chartists of the 19th century, the first great working class political movement who fought for democracy. The suffragettes, now treated almost as secular saints, but demonized, hated in their time, portrayed as terrorists, anarchists, locked up in prisons, force-fed. Those who fought sexism and racism and homophobia, battened in the streets by police officers, spat at. Those who built the National Health Service, the welfare state, all fought for in the teeth of determined opposition from the powerful. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Our ancestors fought for all the rights and gains that we have. Many of them now imperiled. And to be honest with you, it's not for us to allow everything our ancestors fought for at such cost be taken away from us. It's 2015. This is a prosperous nation. There are huge amounts of wealth and talent and ability. There is not an excuse for a single person in a country like this to be without a home they can afford, to be trapped in overcrowded homes, to not have any security in their homes, to not be able to grow up in homes that support them, that don't damage their health and education and well-being. There is no excuse for any of those things. And that's why we come here with our demands. These politicians have to act. We can't carry on in a situation where millions of people are deprived of their basic right and need and aspiration for a home they can call their own and look after themselves and their families with security and dignity. So that's the mission today. And we can win, because people before us fought far greater odds, and they won as well. But we've got to have hope. Tony Benn, a politician who died last year, who I miss very much, he said, the way you get change is the burning flame of anger at injustice and the burning flame of hope at a better world. Now, all too often, there's lots of anger out there, lots of fear as well, but one thing missing, and that's hope. So we've got to have hope. And already we can see, because of people like you and other campaigners, they began to shift their position. They're beginning to offer proposals. In the case of Labour, some form of controlling rents, talk, for example, of building more homes. Not enough, but the fact they're talking about building more homes in the first place is because people fought and put them under pressure from below. And we can see this with all sorts of other campaigns. Take tax avoidance. UK Uncut, groups of young people occupied shops and businesses who were avoiding tax, and they forced tax avoidance on the agenda. I think of the workers down at the Ritzy Cinema in Brixton who fought for the basic principle that they, the people, the workers who kept that cinema open and profitable, that they should have a wage they could live on. And they fought and they faced threats and all the rest of it. But they won a huge increase in their wages, and the same it occurs on cinema as well. And what does that teach us? That if you do have determination and courage and a bit of solidarity, you can beat these people. You can force the powerful to concede. But it is up to all of us not to let ourselves be divided, not to turn on each other in the way all too often they try and make us do. And if we display that courage and determination that those before us displayed, that if we go down to Parliament and not just go home at the end of today and pat ourselves on the back and think, there we go, we gave it a good pop, but keep this campaign going until rents are controlled, until they're building enough homes, until the law is on the side of the tenant rather than always on the side of the landlord, then we keep on fighting until we win. So let's have that courage, let's have that determination, let's have that hope, let's go over there and give them hell, and let's make sure finally, for our generation and generations to come, we finally have justice and we finally have housing that meets our needs, our rights, and our aspirations. Thank you.